Again. There we go. Okay, Tim, we had this fantastic conversation in May, the same month we're talking now. Imagine that about your work, and there was a couple of questions which we sort of wanted to try something new by jumping on a video call chat and going through these questions today. So I had some thoughts on a few of them, but
Yep.
there were even the ones that I had thoughts on. I think it would be great to get your perspective. And I think there was one or two in here where I was just like, I have no idea. Let's let Tim handle this. So here's the first one. Ted says, I hadn't really thought of how much my own money scripts impact the advice I give. Do you have some resources that could help me identify my own scripts? I think it's apparent that I came from much more of a scarcity background, but would like to
Mhm.
go further and explore that a bit more. Thank you, Ted.
Yep.
How would you start if you were helping somebody who gives advice for a living explore their own money scripts?
Yeah. Well, for starters, I applaud Ted for his willingness to acknowledge this. I think that when it hit me, and I remember exactly where I was, we could come back to that if you want, but when it hit me, it was career shifting and life changing that my own money scripts would absolutely dictate in many ways how I was giving advice. It was kind of a humbling thing because I'd been in the business for a long time. And thought that I was carrying myself with as much objectivity as possible. But let me get to the answers
Well,
first.
yeah, I have to mention
Yes.
how impossibly hard it is for me to hear you say that. And I literally have seven questions, and we're gonna let them go because we're
Yeah.
gonna answer Ted's question.
Yeah. Okay. So let's answer Ted's question. Then we could also go down that rabbit hole if you want. So the 101, Carl, the 101 resource is The Financial Wisdom of Ebenezer Scrooge. The
Yeah.
201, and it's really more like the 201, 301, and 401, is a book called Facilitating Financial Health. Both of
Mm,
these books were written by the same trio of authors, Rick Kaler, who's a great financial advisor in Rapid City, South Dakota, Ted Klontz and Brad Klontz. Ted
mhm,
and Brad are father and son. Both are psychotherapists who focused on financial therapy.
mm,
And so the first book I mentioned, The Financial Wisdom of Ebenezer Scrooge, is like the funniest titled book that is actually really, really effective. And you don't have to wait
right.
until Christmas to read it. It's also a great kind of client facing book if you're looking for one of those gifts to give out around the holidays, for example. Facilitating Financial Health is a textbook. And it's not like textbook that it's this thick. I think it's, maybe only 250, 300 pages, but it is so chock full and it's priced that way too. So if you look it up on Amazon, you might pay $50 for a used copy, $100 for a new copy, something like that. But just trust me
Yeah.
when I tell you it's worth every penny. I remember when you and I were both working in the same place, maybe 10 years ago. One of the advisors there, I made this recommendation, and his response after reading Facilitating Financial Health was this should be required reading for all financial advisors. So
Yeah.
it's the real deal.
Yeah, no, I can second Rick and the Clance's work. Amazing. And what I would maybe just add is lots of quiet walks,
Yeah.
So like dive into that stuff, go on a walk. And then and going on a walk is slightly metaphoric. It's probably actually going on a walk, but I think there's also just this idea of learning to pay attention, because getting educated, reading more, getting more knowledge is really important, dot, 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 and it can become a place to hide from the actual work of paying attention to, oh my gosh, I did that again,
Mhm.
or, oh, that's so interesting that every time I had this repeated experience. In fact, Katie Arnold, who is a ultramarathoner and fantastic writer, um, wrote this great memoir called Running Home. I was having a conversation with her once, and she it took maybe a decade, as I recall,
Hmm.
of multiple times a week, her husband, the sound of her husband opening the bills and her leaving the room
Wow.
for her to finally click, like,
Wow.
what is that?
Yeah.
Right. And so once she was like, what is that? Oh my gosh, then there's some work that can start being done. But for a
Hmm.
decade, there was this unconscious behavior that was
Wow.
driving her life. And as I can't remember if it was Freud, I think it was Freud who said, like, until we make the unconscious conscious,
Hmm.
it will drive our behavior, something like that. And we will call it fate. There was this
Yeah.
unconscious behavior of just leaving the room. And finally she's like, wow, she's like, I can still remember the sound. And then she remembered, like, oh, this thing from her parents. And now she has something to sort of unpack a little bit, or at least notice. There might not even be a need to unpack, but at least notice. So I think knowledge, resources, super important. Noticing, paying attention, feeling it in your body, being aware of that, also equally important.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks,
Well,
Ted. Yeah, go ahead. You have one more
yeah, I
thought
want to
there?
add just a little bit to it because once you go down this journey, Ted and anybody else, I want to warn you that one of the first things that will likely come is self-judgment. So
Mm-hmm.
once you do begin, there are exercises in those two books I mentioned that will aid you in illuminating and articulating your money scripts because for most of us, they're driving our behavior, but like you said, until the unconscious becomes conscious. Um, and so once it does, the next thing that is likely to happen is actually to feel a good bit of shame.
Right.
Because once you articulate, like the example I gave, I told you the moment that I saw the switch for me was one of the money scripts that I realized that I had grown up with was the pull yourself up by your bootstraps
Right. Right.
mentality. And that when like if you just work hard enough, then you'll do fine, which also presumes those who aren't doing fine have not worked hard enough, right?
Right.
And then I went on a trip doing microfinance work in Nicaragua and stepped off of a school bus into a place called La Chorreca, which had come to be named as a city. It's actually the Managua city dump, and
Right.
fed children like a bowl of mush. They were born in the dump. Their parents were prostituting kids from the age of 9 and 10 to the trash truck drivers who would dump the garbage off the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and then they would sift through the trash just for the sake of subsistence. And it
Right.
struck me there, like the notion that everybody can just pull themselves up by their bootstraps is utter BS, right?
Yeah.
And so I had to be faced with that. And at that moment, the first thought that came about, or first feeling, was one of shame. And
Yeah.
we know that like conviction is kind of like a good thing. Shame normally is a downward spiral. And so being free to not judge yourself, Kaler and
Right.
Klontz are very quick to remind us that money scripts are neither good nor bad. They just are. They're what
Yeah.
we grew up with in most cases. And then once we find one that we don't particularly like, the awesome thing is we can actually change them.
Yeah.
And that's precisely what happened to me in that moment.
Yeah, totally. And I think the idea too of realizing that that pull yourself up by the bootstraps belief could have at one point been really adaptive behavior. And I love the idea of the posture of turning around and saying to it, like, thank you
Yes.
for all that you gave me, all that you helped me. You may have kept me safe, you kept me working hard, whatever. And
Yeah.
I got it from here. And you can retire now.
Yeah.
Like that idea of treating it with grace and empathy and gratitude rather than shame or anger. And
Yeah.
some of these money scripts, like anger, shame and anger, are absolutely going to come up. And I think the important thing for me is like really learning to like process all that, like clear it. If that means throwing heavy things out in the yard, if that means, going into a quiet room somewhere and yelling, like whatever it
Yeah.
means, like let's process all that. Okay,
Absolutely.
we can talk about this all day. Let me find another second question. Bill, he says, I had, thanks for another great society workshop. I had a question that came towards the end. Tim may have answered. Tim mentioned sometimes a client or prospect will tell an advisor, yeah, this is a good one. Sometimes a client or prospect will tell an advisor what what they think
Hmm.
the advisor wants to hear
Yes.
versus what they really believe. What are some strategies, questions, et cetera, to help avoid or address this tendency?
Yeah. Really
Yeah,
good.
let me just mention something. I think it's Amy Mullen first introduced me to the idea that your very presence in the room
Hmm.
means we won't be having a totally honest conversation about money,
Correct.
right? Your very presence, which is super fascinating.
And let's remember too that each additional presence we add into the room also changes that chemistry.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah,
it's not to suggest that we should never do meetings with pairs or anything like that, because there are benefits to that as well. But just recognize that each person in a meeting is going to change the chemistry. All right. So
yeah.
Bill, this is one that George Kinder has really seared into my brain. There are two different planes of discovery question. One is the broadening plane, and the other is the deepening plane. And
Mm,
so we tend to think, for example, of questions, great questions, prompts like "What else?" and "Tell me more" as the same thing, but one is actually a broadening question and the other is a deepening question.
yeah,
And so the best, or not to say the best, two of my go-to broadening questions are "What else?" and "Anything else?" The illusion that Kinder uses is that you picture a client with 7 to 9 marbles in their pockets, and the objective is to get them to pull each one out, recognizing that the first 3 marbles that they pull out may indeed be the equivalent of the things that they think they're supposed to be talking to you about, right?
right.
So the first couple things may be their investment portfolio or the job change, whatever it might be. And these could be the things, but we don't know yet. And so what we want to do is create the container, the space for them to pull each one of those out. And we use a question like, what else? Now, what else and anything else I use not interchangeably. What else is the one where you're trying to get some momentum going, because what else has the presumption that there is something else to come.
Mm,
Whereas anything else is more like once you have done a good bit of broadening and you think you're there, you think you've put a good amount out
mm,
onto the table, then you can conclude, if you will, with anything else. But note that anything else will probably still result in an encore for our live music fans, right? Like anything else, it almost presumes we're getting toward the end. Like, so when you want to start to
yeah,
shift the focus of the meeting, you'll ask anything else, but still expect leave silence, and then you're probably going to get 1 or 2 more things that come out. And it's altogether possible that the most important thing or things could be things 4, 5, and 6, right? And then once you've identified with your advisory wisdom what those most important thing or things are, that's when you employ the deepening question. And that's where "Tell me more." Or
mm,
"Can you explain that further to me? That
mm.
sounds really interesting." Those are the types of prompts that then take someone deeper into that specific domain.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Rabbi Shira Stutzman was on 50 Fires recently, and I said something that she disagreed with a little bit. And the only way I knew she disagreed is she, in this very beautiful way, said, "Hey, would it be okay if we investigate that a little bit?"
Oh gosh.
Yeah, it was so great. Like she didn't say I'd like to push back, which I would have been fine with. Or can we double click on it? It was like, hey, would it be okay if we investigate that a little bit? I thought that was another great, like getting to getting a little deeper question. The other thing I would mention, Bill, is it's funny because I'm gonna go a little tactical here. Like think about the office environment, the setting. If you should almost, to me, the work out of K-State about your office really pointed closer to a coffee shop slash high-end architect
Yeah.
and away from a bank or CNBC, right? Like,
Yeah.
so I think to me, the goal of all of that work is how can I immediately get somebody to relax a bit, right? Because we just have to realize they're coming in a heightened state because this is about money and you're a stranger. And those things combined, not only are you a stranger, like you've been written about in the newspaper, like
Yeah.
as an industry, right? Like we're not
Yeah.
supposed, this is like going in to see a used car salesman
Yeah,
sometimes in people's minds.
for sure.
So anything we can do to be like, oh, I can relax here. Like that for sure. I mean, for sure, the stuff on the walls, for sure, the books out, if they're complex and they're graphs and they're charts and they're yelling, if the TV's on, just anything you can do to think about, it's again, it's closer to a spa than it
Yeah.
is a bank. And I'm not suggesting it should be a spa. I'm just saying it's closer.
No,
So
yeah.
all of those things with the goal of can we lower the level of tension? Um, okay, we got two more.
Mhm.
Namisha said, thanks for the workshop. Da, 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 da. What stayed with me was how quickly you managed to tap into emotions with that dollar sign exercise. Um, and there were some nice words. It said, and I realized how much that could help me connect with my clients if I could think, or sorry, I realized how much it could help me connect with my clients if I use some sort of visuals in my practice.
Mhm.
Can you recommend any good visual thinking books or share strategies or frameworks that you that I can use to in my client interactions? What do you have to say about that?
Well, um, at the risk of appearing to blow smoke here, I don't think anybody's done better work on the visual piece than you have. So, and that's
Mhm.
probably not news um, to this person either. So, certainly, I believe that's where you have doubled and tripled down. And I also want to go back real quickly to Bill's question and suggest, like, as you are identifying what those things are, consider the opportunity in that container that you've created to use some visuals um,
Mhm.
as points of connection for someone. So if you've got a
Mhm.
whiteboard in there, it could just be the word that comes up that
Mhm.
defines that
Mhm.
respective marble. But if you put those all up there, imagine the impact that that has on a client
Amazing.
being able to see
Yeah.
that and then simply inviting them to orchestrate it and tell you what the most important thing is. But coming back to this question,
Well, wait, just before you move on, let's just mention again that idea of a blank whiteboard is another way of pointing to this is different than what you thought you were coming in for,
Correct.
right? Like a blank page, a yellow pad with nothing written on it.
Yeah.
Like all of those are like, hey, this is a blank slate. So not only does it have the benefit of you don't, as my career has demonstrated, you do not need to have any artistic talent, just writing the word down. But the act of a blank slate that then starts to get filled up a little bit with stuff that's of value to the person is another way, both to Bill's question and Nimish's question, um, is is a way to demonstrate like, hey, we're here for you. This is a different experience. I didn't have a preconceived agenda here. I'm not trying to sell anything.
Mhm.
All of that lowers the tenor of the room and helps you connect really quickly at a level that will be surprising both to you and to the client to be.
Yes. Yeah. So a couple other resources in addition to your work. Do you remember Dan Rome's Back of the Napkin?
Yeah, Dan's the master of
Yeah.
teaching this.
Yeah, so Dan Rome's book, Back of the Napkin. Another book that came to mind, even though it's not explicitly visual, Carl, it is visual for me, is Story Brand by
Yeah.
Donald Miller.
Yep.
Because you know how he does that great job of showing like the path of the story,
Yep.
like the arc,
Yep.
in a seven-fold format that is virtually universal. You'll see show up in everything, movies, commercials, books, and the lives of our clients. So that's another one. The other thing that came to mind for me was, and I wonder if you remember this, the Dimensional has some great practice management stuff, some of the best out there. They have the 4S framework,
Yeah.
basically helps retrain your brain as to how you're going to communicate to a client. And so you start system one, or you start visually, empathically, and you move in the direction of
Yeah.
system two. So you start with stories, you move to sketches, and only then would you ever go to stats to basically like
Right.
certify with
Yeah.
your mind the feeling that now has been cultivated and generated within the client. And then structure, I think, is the last one. But then like
Yeah.
then you move into planning, basically. But starting with stories and sketches, remembering that and that 4S framework. Nimisha, if you have the opportunity to go to one of their communication workshops, they go through this 4S framework and a couple other great mental models that advisors have found really helpful, and I have too.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah. I think a helpful exercise for me is if you were to, if you were to think about a concept that you often explain in words in a client meeting, like maybe it could be something like diversification or it could be like the importance of for instance, it could be the importance of cash flow and budgeting. Like I can't think of a more pedestrian, boring concept. And we all understand how important it is because it funds everything else. Like if you were to think about how you would explain that and then you were to take the next step and write it down, and let me just the link between those two is literally like turn on the mic and explain it,
Mm-hmm.
throw it into the script and get the transcript, right? Like, and you don't even
Yep.
have to take that step now. I just open ChatGPT, go into the dialog box, press the mic button on my thing, and dictate. Now you have the writing. You can go through and clean that up if you need to. So pretend like now you were going to send that to a client.
Mm-hmm.
Here's why cash flow is so important to me, or budgeting, or diversification, or insurance, or whatever. You have it in a form that you could send to a client. I'm not saying send it. I'm saying now pretend like you had to wrap it up in one icon. Like just like you only have room in your brain. This is me. Like the reason I do these things is I only have room in my brain. The mental RAM is so small that I can only hold one concept at a
Yep.
time. So I got to replace it with an image,
Yes.
a little icon, the Coca-Cola sign, the whatever,
Yep.
the dollar sign, right? So if you do that, and then the last thing I would suggest is just think through that process of distilling down to a single idea. Because here's the other way you could do it is now pretend, and you'll see this thread through all of my work, pretend like you grew up in the age where Twitter was important.
Mm.
So now you've got to reduce it to 160 characters.
Yeah.
And in doing that, you're trying not to dumb it down so far that it makes no sense. Like it's still got to be distilled deep wisdom. And the feeling I get when I do this right is like, yeah, that, right? Like
Yes.
that. Like so if you can work on that concept and then you think like and then you go to the image you've created, which will, by the way, be way more stuff than you need because that's what you do as we do as advisors. There will be a bunch of numbers and all these things. And then you say the last bit is this image will not be perfect when there's nothing left to add, but it will be perfect when there's nothing left to take away.
Mm.
And you
So,
literally start taking things
so good.
away and saying, did I lose the point? Now you got to be clear first, like what's the point? I call it the zinger. What's the zinger? Like in the journalism world, we call it the lead. Like what's the punchline? Like what is it? Okay, great. Here's the image I've made. Now, what can I take off of this image and not lose the lead?
Mm.
Then you might be at a point where you're like, okay, maybe this is something I could replicate. Now, you could say to your graphic designer, make this look nice.
Mm-hmm.
You could draw in handwritten, you could do whatever. I find that hand drawn in front of a client on a yellow pad, a napkin, a whiteboard, really there's some fascinating, Dan Roan would probably be able to tell us what it is,
Mm.
but there's some fascinating level of connection, almost primitive genetic level of connection when you see a symbol drawn.
Mm.
Because it becomes a souvenir. Two things. It becomes a shortcut into the idea,
Mm.
but in this case, it becomes a souvenir of the experience, the connection we had together. So now anybody who was at that workshop in May could leave with a dollar symbol drawn on a piece of paper. And that would, if you showed it to anybody else, people would be like, what? It's a dollar symbol. But you went through an experience with it with Tim and I on that workshop, and it's not a dollar symbol anymore to you. It's a
Yeah.
story, it's an experience, it's a memory, it's a feeling, right? So
Yeah.
that's all I have to say about that. Let's last one. Can I get more of the scripts?
Yeah.
That was the question. How
So
would you how would you how would you address can I get more of the scripts?
I can offer a little bit more framework that comes directly from Kaler and Klontz,
Yeah.
uh, but I want to share with Paul a a way that I have started a number of speaking engagements where I begin with 3 or 4 sentences that do come from their work. And I invite people to complete the sentence with the very first thing that comes to mind.
So good. Yeah.
And so the first prompt I'll normally use, and I'll try to use a few of the most kind of diverse kinds that will illuminate a lot of unique stuff. But the first one is normally the wealthy got that way by,
Mm.
and then just let people answer. And I disclaim in advance that you're not likely to be proud of the very first thing that comes to mind. But if you don't say the first thing that comes to mind, the exercise doesn't work. So the wealthy got that way by, boom. And then the next one I'll use is poor people are poor because.
Mm.
The next one I'll use, and normally if I'm just doing three, these will be the three. The third one would be retirement means ellipsis.
Mm.
And it never fails. You know how there are certain exercises and mnemonics that we'll do in a speaking engagement that might be like 70%, 80, 90%. You're like, I hope this one works for this particular
Right.
audience.
Right. Right.
This is the one that has a 100% rate
Yeah.
of return, because whether I'm talking to a group of college students, whether I'm talking to a diverse group of clients, that's super easy. Or even if I'm talking to the super um, homogenous group of advisors,
Mm.
maybe especially advisors. It's fascinating. You will get polar opposites to those answers. You'll get wealthy got that way by hard work, investing well, so on and so forth. But you might expect in a financial advisor audience, it never fails. The wealthy got that way by somebody says inheritance. Well, automatically, right there, you've established the continuum. On one end of the continuum is working hard. The other end of the continuum is inheritance, which
Right.
the immediate implication there is you didn't have to work at all for it.
Yeah.
And so regardless of the homogeneity, is that a word, of the audience, it is always coming up diverse, the
Yeah.
responses that people have to these. So the way that Kaler and Klontz will break it down further in the book is they talk about 4 categories of money scripts just to further.
Tim, real quick,
Yeah.
which book? The textbook one?
Actually, it's much of this comes directly from the Financial Wisdom of Ebenezer
Okay.
Scrooge.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they'll talk about the 4 categories, Carl. Money avoidance, stuff like money is bad, rich people are greedy, money worship, more money will make me happier, money is the key to freedom, money status, like my self-worth equals my net worth, and then money vigilance, like it's important to save for a rainy day, I should always live below my means. Now, the funny thing is, as I read through those, everybody who's listening to this is going to have kind of like a visceral response to each one. They'll identify or they won't identify. And I'd be willing to bet you they'll say, some people will say, oh, that's a good one. That's a bad one. But
Right.
the idea is to strip it of those labels and to simply be honest with ourselves in illuminating what those money scripts are. And then you'll find them clumping, right? Like if you grew
Yeah.
up in a certain area, in a certain family, you're going to have clumps of money scripts that will seem to be similar. Hence the 4 different categories they give us here.
So good. Yeah, and I'm not sure, and I don't think this is the place for it, for us to sort of sort out like at what point and when would you use that in a prospective client or client meeting, and it may be 5 years into a relationship and it may be 5 minutes into a relationship, and that's the beautiful dance. But that's such great stuff for small and large group presentations. Like
Yeah.
you're invited to do the workshop at the, I don't know, is Kiwanis still a club? Or the chamber of local chamber of commerce,
Yeah.
the whatever you're invited to do some group workshop around money. One thing I would add that makes this super interesting is hand out 3x5 cards and just ask people to label. Like if you're going to use if you use those exact ones and you say, just write down 1, 2, and 3 on your card. And now I want you, don't answer out loud, write down the answer. Please don't put your name on the card. write down the answer, and you go through all three and you get all three answers written down, and then you ask them to hand in the cards with no names on it. And now you've got the cards in front of you and you can flip through and find something. I've used this for 90 minutes. Like you flip through and find something, and like that first question, the wealthy got that way by, and the first thing that popped in was stealing. Like beyond
Yeah.
inheritance.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Okay. So the
cronyism.
continuum goes further.
Yeah, it goes further. And so it'd be really interesting if you got that card and you're flipping through it and you see stealing, and you could just say, "Hey, I don't want to pick on anybody." But and the way I soften this often, because I use this with the dollar sign one, is I'll just say, "Gosh, there was lots of answers around crony capitalism, or like, oh, and one of these says stealing. I'm not asking anybody to raise their hands, but let's talk about that. Like, what
Hmm.
could that mean? Like, how did that come up? What would you do? Why that?" And often somebody will go, "Hey, that was my card."
Hmm.
And you can be like, "Zoom," pretend like everybody
Love
else
it.
is gone and just say, and I often say that, let's pretend like everybody else is just you and me, brother. Like nobody else is even here.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that. Where did that come from? When did you first learn that?
Yeah.
I love the question of like, when you think of that answer, stealing, where do you
Mm.
feel it?
Mm.
Sometimes I'll even ask, if it was a color,
Hmm.
that feeling, what color would it be?
Yeah.
Right. And so now you've got this, like, you suddenly could do a 90-minute workshop, a client appreciation event on just processing that. And I should be careful here. That requires some practice, and so maybe don't run out and do that without practicing it. But it's such an interesting place, like interesting way to get quickly to discussions that nobody's ever had.
Yeah. Carl, can I hit something that you addressed that just gave me chills? And it actually
Yeah.
connects back to the first question.
Yep.
So we have a tendency, and I think especially the members of the society, we have a tendency to learn something new, to feel it in a way that is revelatory, and then to immediately want to use it. And I might even use the word impose it.
Right.
So I wanna invite everybody as who's watching this discussion to go back to this first question and think first about how does it change you?
Yeah.
How does it change you? Not everything that we learn, not everything that we sense as a revelation is something that immediately needs to become part of our client experience. It absolutely could be, Carl, right?
Or become content to be shared with the world. And my
Right.
wife is always like, "Come on, seriously, can we just experience something?"
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so let's go back to that first question and
Love
allow
that.
that to be step one. How does this change me? Because
Yeah.
as it changes you and as you grow, it's going to make you a better advisor, naturally, whether you turn it into a client experience element or a tool or a
Anyway,
technique or a method.
beautiful. Yeah, no, no, I love that. Krista Tippett, on Being Host, we were having a conversation. I asked her what enough means to her, and she cited a Rilke poem, like Letters to the Young Poet, I think it was in. She said, "That's a question I think I'll live with for the next year. I think I'll just live with that question."
Yeah,
And I love that idea of like, maybe don't do anything with any of this except go on a walk,
yeah,
journal, take yourself through it. How do you complete those three questions?
yeah,
How do you answer those three questions? How do you simplify something? How do you like go through all of that? What scripts are you walking around with? That's
yeah.
amazing, Tim. This was massively valuable. Anything to wrap us up, or is that it?
The one thought you gave me with the mention of Krista is this. Um, we progress from knowledge to application to wisdom.
Mm,
Clients don't pay a premium for knowledge. That's
mhm.
ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's a commodity. Application is like, okay, now you've got your CFP and you can figure out how to do somebody's diversification. Clients are paying a premium for our wisdom. And so
Mhm.
as we grow, as you grow,
Mhm.
advisor, um, you are a better advisor for your client.
For sure. Yeah. Want to be a better want to be a better planner, be a better human.
Yeah.
Cheers, Tim.
Appreciate you, man.
Yeah.